Hello to the world. I'm going to be speaking about Islam. And this is a tricky subject because there's just so much socio-political weight with this. There's a lot of emotions tied up with this, and a lot of, the whole Israel-Palestine debate. There's political. We got world leaders threatening each other over this. So I'm going to take time with this one. And we're going to go slow. And I've seen resources on this kind of thing before. And everyone on both sides is always so angry. And so I want to give a space for people to think and listen and question and learn without all that negative energy. But also holding to truth. So, through this next series, I'm going to be talking about how to treat Muslims. I'm going to spend this whole episode on that. Okay, and then I'm going to, later on in the next episodes, I'll talk about what is Islam. Because that's the question that needs to be asked. Then, what are the basic beliefs of Islam? What needs to be true in order for Islam to be true? And then, has the Quran changed over time? You'll see why that's important later. And who was Muhammad? So we're going to talk about all those things, but today we're going to be talking about how to treat Muslims. After 9/11, the world changed. And this wasn't just for Americans. It was especially different now for American Muslims. They had to live with a shadow over them. It's discrimination, fear, distrust. They had to navigate what was happening. They had to answer questions like, who are you, being asked by the world? What do you stand for? This is all very unfortunate, and there's not much information there except you see this reaction now on both sides. One side, like Trump, calls for a ban on all Muslim immigration. The other side, like Joe Biden in the news, calls it a religion of peace. I think Obama did too, and he quotes Surah 5. We'll get to that. Which side is correct? We'll be exploring that and many other issues. So first, let's talk about how to treat Muslims. Here's a shocker: love. You're supposed to treat them with love. Oh my gosh. What is this reminding me of? Oh, I gotta do that later. Okay. I remember one time at an airport, I think, were we going to Israel? I can't remember. But I saw this girl with a hijab, and she looked like she was about to cry, and she was sitting alone. I felt led by the Spirit to buy her a coffee and handed it to her. And when I did, her whole demeanor changed. It turned out she was an American from California. Had an American accent, just as American as you could possibly be. She just happened to have a hijab on. And this made her day, and we sat and laughed together talking about this. When she had to get on her plane soon, and we just joked about all the ways that she could try to hide it in her hijab and stuff, and it was a very special moment. But this is not the average story. Okay, this isn't what just happens every day. There's a former Muslim named Nabil Qureshi who has written a bunch of books on the subject. I recommend all of them, but specifically in one called Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus, he remarks that after moving to the United States, no one invited his parents to dinner. Actually, I'm not sure if that was in his book that I heard that. It might have been in one of his speeches. But he talks about in his book how growing up he always felt alone. And he always felt different. And often these people, like Nabil Qureshi, have these names that are different. And they have to go through life being treated differently. And this is terrible. Okay, I hate the way us humans divide into tribes and attack each other. The American Muslim people are some of the sweetest people you'll ever meet. At least in my experience. When I was a kid, I had two best friends. Okay, one was an atheist and one was a Muslim, and I loved them both to death. And this has affected my worldview. That and being part of the millennial generation where truth is relative and we need to not worry about our differences and unite and stuff, which I'm sort of like emotionally on board with, but not intellectually. We'll get into that. The Muslim kid I knew, his name was Salim, and he was kind and compassionate, and he was intelligent, and he was hilarious. So was my atheist friend, Kirk. We were too young to realize that we're supposed to be enemies, at least in some circles. I think in the United States, you can get along with people who believe differently from you better than just about any other place in world history. And you might be thinking, oh, there's no way that's true. Guys, insulting each other on Facebook is a very different thing than what has happened in world history and what's going on in other countries. You've got to start reading the news of other countries and looking at history. You start getting a very complex and nuanced view of humanity and realizing, you know what, we have it pretty freaking good. I've had the privilege of teaching some immigrant kids from Saudi Arabia. They're Muslims. They're some of the best students you could ask for. So they weren't even American Muslims. They're Saudi Arabian Muslims. They're goofy. They're playful. They're kind. They're intelligent. I saw them being compassionate. One who I especially... Well, I loved both him and his sister. One, we'll call him Zaid. I enjoyed playing video games with him. He was a nerd like me. But his English was imperfect because, it's a difficult language. I have tried learning Arabic, and his English was way better than my Arabic. Sahab. Well, whatever, I'm not going to try. Al khair. Good morning. Okay, but he used to play video games with me. And I would be like, oh, Zaid, I'm going to beat you so bad. He'd be like, you dream. And it was so funny to me. Just like saying you and dream with no helping verbs or anything with that accent. The other one, the girl, the sister, she would teach me Arabic. Oh, Sabah al Khair. That's how you say it. I think that's how you say good morning. Anyway, she taught me some Arabic, and I've learned more on my own. It was very difficult because the letters change depending on where they are in a word, and there's so many of them. But some of them look the same, except it's just a dot. Anyone who knows Arabic or has had to try to study Arabic, so probably American Muslims who wanted to know Arabic are going to be like, yeah, it's so difficult. Okay. But if they weren't sweet, even if they weren't generous, even if they weren't intelligent, even if they weren't the most hospitable kids I've ever met, even if they weren't, they're probably some of the best kids I've ever had in my career teaching. Even if I hadn't literally loved every Muslim I've ever met, and I can honestly say I have, I would still be obligated to treat them with love. Why? Because that's what Christians are supposed to do. We love our enemies. Okay? And how much easier is it to love our Muslim brothers and sisters that aren't even our enemies, who are literally doing nothing wrong? Okay, if we're supposed to love our enemies, how much more are we supposed to love our friends? And these guys are our friends. Okay. So that cleared out of the way, we know where I stand on how to treat Muslims. Love, respect, and dignity. Let's continue on. This is tricky, so I'm going to talk about now what Islam is. And there's a tension on how to define it. And you're like, what? It's because in Christianity, especially in Protestantism, we've been so influenced by the idea of sola scriptura and, solo file. I can't remember. In Spanish, it's fiel for loyalty. I don't know how to say faith in Latin. I think it's file. Whatever, you get the idea. So there's this idea of returning to the scriptures, and what the scriptures say is the real Christianity. Even myself, I guess officially you could say I'm a Protestant, but my reasoning with that is, the Greco-Roman historiography is based around the person of Jesus. If we're going to learn about him, we need to go to the primary sources. There's not that idea necessarily in Islam. A lot of authority is just given to you through your imam, which is like your teacher. or through your parents. You don't necessarily rely on primary sources the way you do in Christianity. This is part of the reason there's so much diversity within Islam. I debated this with a friend from Princeton before he kind of opened up my mind to it. There's a tension. Is Islam what Muslims currently believe? Like the ones that are around us? Or is it beliefs laid down in the Quran and Hadith? And any Muslim who's listening will probably be asking, what in the world is the difference? Just hold on with that and pretend and suppose for a moment that they're two different things. Okay? I'm not even going to argue yet that they're two different. Let's just pretend they are. I feel like if I were a Muslim, the original beliefs would be the true ones. So if you're a Muslim who's wired the same way my brain is, you'd think they're the true ones. If Muhammad was the prophet, that was the seal of the prophets, and Allah spoke a perfect book to him, that would require us to follow the dictates of the perfect book, correct? This is just a mind experiment. I haven't claimed there's any difference yet, but just bear with me. My friend Andrew, on the other hand, claims the beliefs held by modern Muslims are what is actually the religion of Islam. So maybe we're talking about two different things here. So there is a difference, but for the rest of the podcast, I'm going to be mostly focusing on the historical figure Muhammad and the closest things to primary sources we can get, which is the Hadith, and we'll talk about an early narrative of Muhammad's life later. I think written by Ibn Ishaq. To figure out who he was and what he believed. We're going to try and get in his head as historians. Okay? It's almost universally attested that to be a Muslim, you must say the Shahada. It's a prayer that states, there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad was his prophet. With that, you can be a Muslim. With that, you are also appointed You're also pointing to this historical Muhammad as a spokesperson for God. That's what a prophet means. It's a messenger for God. At least within Christian tradition, a prophet just means that you're a messenger for God. It doesn't necessarily mean you're telling the future. Okay. When a Muslim says the word prophet, they're meaning something more intense. They're a messenger for God, but they're also, I think they have a tradition that a lot of their prophets are sinless. And that there have been, I think, 144,000 sent to mankind throughout time. We'll get into all that in later episodes. So what are the basic beliefs of Islam? What does this historical figure Muhammad have for us to hear today? What do modern Muslims believe? Let's start there, and we'll talk about what modern Muslims around us believe, especially in the West, and then we'll work back to what is going on in history. When I was in college, I wanted to do a project proving that Islam was peaceful and present it. I think I did it for a class. I might have just done it on my own. So I called up my friend from grade school, Salim, and he informed me of the basic things that I needed to know. These sound so just obvious to me now, but I think there might be listeners who it would help. Islam and Arabic culture are two different things. Islam is a religion. Arabic is an ethnicity and a culture. You aren't necessarily Arabic if you're Muslim, and you're not necessarily Muslim if you're Arabic. Okay, that was, I remember being like, oh, wow, okay. I just knew absolutely nothing. Salim was an American, just like any other American, and his beliefs about the world were virtually indistinguishable from other Americans. If you sat and talked to him about, freedom of speech or rights for women, he would be indistinguishable from a modern American. That was as far as my investigation went, and that was as far as it needed to go, at least for that chapter of my life. The world's full of people who love to hate, and so it made sense to me that they would be just like anyone else, but people hate them anyway. The following quotes from aboutislam.net. The Prophet Muhammad is a 7th century man loved by more than 1.6 billion people in the world today. He is a man who lived in a time where the strong dominated the weak. Female children were buried alive and women were little more than possessions traded from father to husband. However, before he died, the world had been transformed. No longer did the weak perish simply because they were weak. The common person was given a voice, and women were liberated from the shackles that bound them. The Arabian Peninsula changed. Its religion went from paganism and idolatry to worship of one God. Tribal quarrels gave way to solidarity and cohesion, and drunkenness and debauchery turned to sobriety and piety. Muslims across the centuries and across the world do not worship the Prophet Muhammad. They understand only too well that he is just a man, a human being like every other human being on this earth. They also understand he is a man who excelled in whatever role was thrust upon him. He seized every opportunity to please God. In the 21st century, we have the advantage of being able to look across time and see what an excellent man Prophet Muhammad was, and understand how even people who hated him viewed him as a man of exceptional qualities. He was, as the Quran so eloquently stated, a man of excellent character. And then I skip a chunk and go to, I'm still reading from aboutislam.net. Prophet Muhammad excelled at business and marriage and fatherhood. In fact, for some years, he lived an enviable lifestyle. Due to his honesty and fair dealings with all people, he also became known as Al-Sadiq, the truthful. He was gentle and hospitable man whose admirable qualities and kind way of dealing with others made people want to draw close to him. He was able to deal justly with people, and many came to him for advice and often asking to mediate disputes. When he was 40 years old, Muhammad was shocked to find that he was to be the final prophet of God. Nabil Qureshi in his book reflects on Muhammad as his mother taught him about him. Ami taught me to love Muhammad because he was the greatest man who ever lived, and there was no close second. She taught me that his generosity was abundant, his mercy was incomparable, and his love for mankind was beyond measure. I was taught he would never wage war unless he was defending the Ummah, that's the Muslim people, and he fought to elevate the status of women and the downtrodden. He was the perfect military leader, he was the ultimate statesman, and he was the exemplary follower of Allah. He was Al-Insan, Al-Kamil, the perfect man. He was Ramatu Lil Alamin, God's mercy personified for the world. It was easy to bear witness that such a man is Rasul Allah, the messenger of God. I remember as a kid reading about Islam in the game Age of Empires 2. I don't know if any of y'all have ever played that game. And learning about how great of a military commander Saladin was. And I really respected Saladin playing his campaigns. I read a story about the Prophet Muhammad cutting off a piece of his cloak so that he would not awaken a cat that he was sleeping on. He was so gentle. I think I mentioned this later on in one of my later episodes. I'll quote you the tradition. I also, as a kid, saw Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, and I learned about how Europe was backward and the Muslims were technologically and culturally superior. And I learned that the Holy Land was in a total state of peace, and ignorant Westerners in the Crusades invaded and killed everyone, starting never-ending war. And Nabil talks about when President Clinton shamed the West for the Crusades after 9/11 happened. So that was kind of my worldview, and that's kind of like the Western cultural worldview. And I'd see people on social media saying all religions teach love, so end the hate, and mantras like that. I think all of this is a reflection of my culture and snippets of the perception of Western Muslims. It's a reaction to hatred that, oh my God, my heart is on board with, okay? And there needs to be a reaction to hatred. We can't just let hatred exist. We can't discriminate against Muslims. But here is where things are going to get nuanced in this podcast. And people these days hate nuance, but it has to come. You can't love someone but ignore reality. Okay, you can't love someone, but if you love someone, you need to also respect truth. You can do both. You can love people and respect truth. You can avoid discrimination and think critically, and read primary resources instead of just taking whatever it is you're being told. As a reminder, primary resources are resources that date back to the time of the events described. But when we're talking about, as far as the events described, the earliest beliefs of Islam, or the binding beliefs of Islam, even if they're written 250 years after the life of Muhammad, they would still be considered a primary source, because we're talking about the binding beliefs that are on Muslims. And that would be a primary source for that, even if it's not a primary source for the Prophet Muhammad. The closest we can get is the Quran. It was written shortly, at least the first version of it. We'll get into that later. Gosh, this is a mess. The first version of it was written pretty soon after he died by Zayd Thabit, I think is his name. We'll talk about that in a later podcast too. Now, between Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, with Morgan Freeman playing Azim, who's this wonderful, compassionate, intelligent Muslim, between that wonderful, peaceful, educated, he was hated by other characters, wonderful character, and a hadith written right after 900 AD. We'll talk about which of these do you think reflects a man who lived in 632? Okay, which do you think is going to give us more accurate data? We'll get to hadith here later, but just the purpose of this podcast was to say, hey, some people, they're modern Muslims and they're wonderful, sweet people. Okay, and their religious system is basically a Muhammad who's indistinguishable from Jesus, except that he also fought battles. Okay, that's kind of like their Islam. And then there's also potentially, got into it, there's also potentially a different story going on in the primary sources that are earliest and closest to Muhammad's time. And I'll talk about what the Quran is and what the Hadith are and why they're important to know about. Alright, love you guys. And oh yeah, just one more thing. If you're a Muslim and you're listening, you know what? You can play video games with me anytime and I will love you. We can be friends, and I do not care what your religious beliefs are when it comes to being my friend. So, just that to stomp out the tribalism, my religion good, your religion bad, okay? That's not about that. It's not tribes here. We're part of the same tribe as far as I'm concerned. We're the human race, and I'm going to love on you. And you know what? Honestly, if you love truth, we're part of the same tribe there too. So, if you think your religion's true, it can take scrutiny. You know what? You could message me and try to convert me, I don't think it's going to work. I think I know too much at this point. But I want you to feel open to do that, and I'll listen. Okay, love you all, and I'll see y'all next episode.